We are putting lots of data before you on this conference, I'm realizing, but we have one more piece. And before we start formally this session, we just asked Jer Fitzgerald to just say 3 minutes on a new paper that he's written. He writes some op-eds sometimes. He's teaching at George Mason. And he's got this new paper that Aspen, our office, has commissioned over the course of the last year and a half that's essentially on traditional versus new media, the rise of Substack and film and all kinds of things that are splintering out that people can do on their own, new financial realities for journalism and philanthropy. And so this report is either before you, is it before you or is it in a stack somewhere? Do you have this? Great, just another something to take home on the flight today. But Jer, what's this paper about? Give us 3 minutes.
Hi, good morning everybody. Thank you, Josh, for that introduction. So the paper basically looks at the intersection of the kind of changes in religious dynamics that Alan spoke about yesterday, and also the changes and sort of fairly rapid changes in the media environment in terms of fragmentation and changing formats and how different forms of media are delivered and consumed. So for example, in the cable TV arena, audiences obviously are shrinking and aging, leading to the decline of sort of the televangelist. And I was just talking to Jack Jenkins about this, and one kind of outcome of this is at the National Religious Broadcasters Conference, CBN are now kind of relegated to a small corner, right? And there are a whole load of new players in that area. And so those new players include things like the rise of streaming services, the entry of Amazon and Netflix into faith-based and values-driven programming, the emergence of more ardently kind of religious programming, organizations such as the Great American Media Network, Great American Pureflix, etc. Also then in the podcasting realm, there's been sort of explosive growth and some sort of, it's kind of a chaotic ecosystem, needs some sort of stabilization. Then obviously you're all familiar with the sort of decline of the dedicated religion beat at a lot of newspapers, the rise of Substack as a platform for religious expression and commentary. And then in the book market, obviously in the kind of later 2000s, there was the emergence of Kindle and the effects that had on physical book sales, and a sort of precipitous decline over time, which is now stabilized, and maybe the role being played by Gen Z there in arenas such as Instagram, where you've hashtag book talk that has sort of regenerated interest in physical books among Gen Z and more generally. And then these huge developments in social media with sort of boomers dug in Facebook, millennials and Gen Z gravitating more towards short form video formats like Instagram and TikTok, and also the emergence of the kind of breakout influencer on those platforms, and various manifestations of that which are algorithm driven, such as sort of positive motivational type faith-based and values-driven messaging, but also kind of more politicized, exclusivist, Christian nationalist type messaging. So, lots of different kind of new breakout influencers doing a sort of range of different things on those short form formats. So, as Josh mentioned, the report is available. We're definitely interested in soliciting feedback on it. It's kind of in draft form right now. What do you find most helpful about it? What's missing? Where should we think about doing a deeper dive? Any approaches you might suggest for doing a deeper dive in certain areas? And so that's, in a nutshell, what the report's about.
So welcome your feedback sincerely, and we're going to be doing a little bit more with this in the coming months. So this pivot this morning now is to sort of, we've talked about the data and the what yesterday. We've talked about sort of implications when it comes to the why, and I'm trying to understand those pieces. the title is okay this morning, The Embattled American Cleric. It's really, that was a hat tip to Chris's old book a long time ago on the evangelicals being embattled and thriving. This is not a conversation about evangelicals as much as it is about clerics overall. There are about 470,000 clerics in the United States today, as Mark says in his new report, which is a 66-page piece and a piece of work that he has just directed. This just dropped last Wednesday. Took a bunch of work and really kind of hovers around 2019, 2020 data, but that's been contextualized in a bunch of new ways. It says a lot of things, that we're 17% female as clerics, that we're graying, mostly satisfied with our work, although perhaps maybe less so in the main line. Sometimes sending different signals across the board on politics in terms of nudges or signals from the pulpit, different views on climate change, different views on treating depression, and a lot more that we're going to hear about from Mark first. But this piece is also new, like the Pew survey. Comes from 1,600 in-depth interviews and a larger data set that they collected, as I mentioned, 5 years ago. So sort of on the cusp of what Alan talked with us about yesterday, the sort of leveling off, and clergy views and experience on a bevy of fronts. So we asked Mark today to really kind of lean into 5 areas: navigating politics, work and career, how that's going for clergy, mental health, end-of-life challenges, and climate change. How are things looking from the pulpit? Mark Chaves, and it is Chaves. I used to think it was Chaves. Mark Chaves. Okay, well,
either. People
Take your
don't like to hear, when they ask how to pronounce your name, they don't like to hear, however you want is fine.
All right.
I understand that.
Mark
Chaves
Chaves
is what I say.
is the Scott Distinguished Professor at Duke University, where he teaches Divinity School in particular. And Yonat Shimron has covered national politics at the Religion News Service for more than 20 years as a national reporter and as a senior editor. And over to the two of you, starting with Mark.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks so much for having me and for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here. I've really enjoyed it. And I hope we have as interesting a conversation this morning as we had yesterday, because yesterday was super fun. I'm going to tell you about findings from the National Survey of Religious Leaders. You can tell that I need a better publicist because, the Pew report was called Religious Trends, Stable, and Chris's book is called Why Religion is Obsolete, and my little report is called Clergy in America. And but there is lots of interesting things in there, a lot of different subjects, and I'm just going to tell you about some of them, and then we can talk about whichever ones you find most interesting. So the National Survey of Religious Leaders is, as Josh mentioned, a survey of a nationally representative sample of clergy, meaning people who lead congregations. That's the sample. It's all religious groups. There's rabbis in here, there's imams, there's leaders of Buddhist and Hindu temples. There's not enough of them to isolate out. So as you'll see from my tables, I only focus on variations among the 4 major kind of Christian groups, the 4 major Christian groups: mainline Protestants, evangelical conservative Protestants, Black Protestants, and Catholics. But the numbers that are all clergy or all primary leaders are include everybody else as well, but there's just not enough numbers to pull them out. I'm going to say clergy. The terminology is a little misleading because not all leaders of congregations are ordained clergy. So, for example, Mormon bishops are in here, but they're famously, of course, not exactly clergy, but they are leaders of congregations. So I'll say clergy, but you know what I mean. It's leaders of congregations. There's 1,600 leaders, which includes kind of the main leader and any kind of assistants. We included them all in the survey. Almost everything I'm going to tell you here is about the primary leaders. It's a much more well-defined group because the assistants, there's lots of heterogeneity among them, so it's kind of cleaner to focus on the primary leaders. So that's what I'm going to do here. There's 890 of them. What else should I say methodologically? It's if I do say so myself, a very high quality sample and survey. We have a 70% response rate. I have don't discern any serious non-response bias in it. I'm not going to go into detail about how we generated the sample and so on. If you have questions about that, you can talk to Ryan, because I explained it all to him last night. So he'll be able to tell you. But if you want to know, I'll talk about it. But I'm not going to start like that. It's all online. This report, I left a couple copies of some uncorrected proofs, so you can browse if you want. I'll leave that one too if you want to look at it. But it's online on our website. There's also a press kit there that includes 5 what we called short reads on kind of key topics. So if you're, don't want to write your own story, we kind of wrote some for you. And what else should I say by way of introduction? The data were gathered in 2019, 2020. I'm not a journalist, I'm an academic. I write slowly. And so I wish this report came out 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but here it is. The report's new. Some of this findings have been out there before, but not all of them. And the other thing I'll mention is there's some of the, this is the first, in 2001, there was a national survey of clergy that was kind of comparable and high quality, conducted by Jackson Carroll. So we use that as an earlier data point for some things where we have common questions. For lots of the questions, nobody's asked a national sample of clergy before, and so this is the first time we have information about that. But when you see data from 2001, that's where it's from. It's from Jack Carroll's 2001 survey. You can see we ask about a lot of different subjects. I'll talk about some of them at the get-go, like Josh mentioned, with his help to focus on some things. But then we can talk about whatever you want after we get there. Okay, so I'll start with just some basic demographics. The slides, by the way, do have numbers, they're itty-bitty little numbers in the bottom right-hand corner, so you can follow along. So slide 5 shows you a basic, I think actually a pretty important fact about American clergy, which is they're aging. The median age, and this is not big differences across any groups really, the median age was 52 in 2001, it's 59 now. We're all getting older, but the clergy are getting old, the church people are also getting older, which is kind of a consequence of the things that Alan was telling us about the generational differences. That's not a surprise, but the clergy are aging even faster than the people are, because younger people are less likely to go into the clergy. There's going to be way more to say about any of this, but I'm going to just kind of go fast so then we can focus on in more depth on the things you want to focus on. So that's a basic fact. On slide 6, the clergy, with the exception, only among Catholics is there substantial ethnic variation among clergy. In the white Protestant groups, the clergy are overwhelmingly white, non-Hispanic. The black Protestant churches are led overwhelmingly by black people. Only among Catholics, again, this is not that surprising, obviously, because of the Hispanic and also other immigrant priest population. The Catholic priests are a lot more likely to be foreign-born than any of the other clergy in any of the other groups. There's almost all, maybe literally all of the increase in ethnic diversity among clergy since 2001 is among Catholics. The Protestants have not diversified much in the last 20 years. The percent of female clergy continues to inch up. Now 17% of all congregational leaders are female. That, of course, varies dramatically across religious groups. They're mainly concentrated in the mainline liberal Protestants, where a third of leaders are female now. Even among evangelicals, though, it's now 5% as opposed to virtually none 20 years ago. It's increased among black Protestants in a noticeable way. So this is, I think, moderately interesting. People are sometimes surprised that it's not higher than that at this point, but this is kind of consistent with more general stalling of female leadership in various institutional, occupational fields. So there's a big increase that started in the 70s, but it has seemed to have kind of leveled off. It will continue to inch up among mainline, but not quickly at this point. And there's lots to say about that. Okay. Slide 9, some things about their work. Well, first their education, just kind of their work settings and careers. The big point here is that there's a big difference between mainline Protestant and Catholic clergy on the one hand, and evangelical and Black Protestant clergy on the other hand, in aggregate, in that the vast majority of Catholic and mainline have graduate degrees, basically. As you can see, 90, 84%. Way fewer among evangelicals and Black Protestants. There's basically two different models of, I'm oversimplifying, but there's basically two different models of religious leadership out there. One is the more professional graduate education, do a national job search when you want to hire somebody, credentialing, processes and so on, which characterize Catholics and Protestants, not the national search part, but you see what I mean. And then a more, less professional model where people are less likely to have graduate education. On slide 10, you can see were they part of the congregation before they became the leader. And as you can see, that's almost never true for Catholics or mainline Protestants, but it's not uncommon at all. A third or so for evangelical and Black Protestants, are more likely to draw people from within the congregation for their leadership. That's even more true if you look at what we call the secondary leaders, not just the primary leader, but the various assistants. Okay. Slide 11, so this is something that did surprise me. 2/3 of all clergy are second career. And I was surprised by how high that number was. And it's kind of across, obviously there's big differences, but even among the mainline, it's 62% mainline Protestants, lower among Catholic priests. But I was so surprised with that, I thought it can't be right, and we kind of dug into the data of people reporting their summer lifeguard job or something like that and they're not. They really were working full-time post-college in some other job before they decided to be ministers. This is related, that you probably all know, the increasing age of seminary students. It's part of the overall aging of the clergy that 22 fewer and fewer 22-year-olds are going to seminary. So the average age of in seminaries is 30 or something now. Don't quote me on that number. I don't know if that's the exact number, but it's increased, and this is part of that story. A noticeable number are bivocational. They have two jobs. A noticeable minority are serving more than one congregation. One thing that's interesting about this, and is also surprising to me, is that there's no evidence of either this percentage of second career or the bivocational increasing since 2001. That seems to have been true for a long time, and that people are surprised to hear that because fewer churches can afford a full-time minister, so you'd kind of think that it's more, maybe especially the bivocational, there's more people doing that, but it's that hasn't increased over time, it looks like. What has increased, and we show it in slide 12, is slight increase in the percent serving more than one congregation. That's been the main response to declining resources in congregations and pastors serving more than one, priests being assigned to different, multiple parishes, yoking of parishes, yoking of congregations. That shows up in the data. I show you the salary of everything. I don't, even though these data were collected in 2019, 2020, I think there's very little reason to think anything's changed, but salaries probably have changed. So these are 2019, 20 salary numbers. They do include housing. I don't think it's that surprising what those numbers are. One thing that is interesting to point out is on slide 14 about there's been an important shift over the last couple of decades in how clergy are compensated, and a real move away from congregation-provided housing to housing allowances, giving people money, which is not taxable to, so as you can see in 1976, which is from actually national survey data, the 61%, that's probably an underestimate of clergy were in congregation-provided housing. That's only about 20%. And so that's a real shift, which has, by the way, really helped clergy's financial well-being over this period. Okay, then let's move on to some storylines, what I think of as storylines. Still on their occupation, I think there's a narrative out there that clergy are particularly stressed out and burned out and wanting to leave and just unhappy, compared to other professionals. Like this is they're under so much stress, and I think it's essentially not true. And not that, everybody's under stress, clergy are under stress, but they are pretty happy overall, the ones who. And so you can see on slide 16, this shows the basic story. Almost all of them say that they're very or moderately satisfied with their work. 85% feel satisfied with life almost every day. 84% feel happy almost every day, feel cared for. 70% completely or moderately agree that life is close to ideal. Only 10-ish% often consider leaving so I think this is a corrective to some narratives out there about clergy being overly stressed out. I haven't compared this to these kinds of numbers in other occupations, but when people do, clergy are always high compared to other occupations in their job satisfaction. And so we should be cautious about the narratives of there's a whole industry, of course, of providing help to stressed out clergy that, like the narrative of they need a lot of help. But again, it's not that when we get to some of the health stuff, if we get to it, you'll see, I think there is maybe a health crisis, but there's a health crisis in the society. It's not, for example, we have their obesity rates, and they've really gone up over the last couple decades, but so has the population, and they exactly match the obesity rates, for example, of their depression rates are lower than for the population as a whole. And so I think that's one storyline here. What is, and this was surprising to me, I think a storyline here is on page 17, their mainline clergy are less happy than other clergy. Almost no matter how you measure it. On the first one, they are just as likely to say they're very or moderately satisfied with their work, but on all these other items, also on the depression item, which is not on here, it's on a later slide, they are slightly higher percentage. Now, we don't want to overstate, it's still the case that majorities of the mainline are feel satisfied with life, etc., all these things, but a slightly noticeable 10 or 15 percentage points fewer of them express the highest levels of happiness. To me, this is really interesting and calls out for explanation. We have tried to answer why this is and have failed in the sense that, some obvious things are, okay, they're more female. Are females less happy? That doesn't explain it. They are more likely to be in declining congregations. Does that explain it? No, that doesn't explain it either. As you'll see later, they're more likely to be politically mismatched with their people, more likely to be more liberal than their people. Does that explain it? No, it doesn't. So everything we could think of as that we had in the data to try to explain why that is, doesn't fully explain it. So maybe you all can figure it out by talking to people why I have speculative ideas, which maybe I'll hold off on for now, but I think that's really interesting and kind of news. And this has not been reported before this for today. Climate change. We asked a bunch of questions about science in various ways, clergy attitudes about science. This one's interesting, so we're on slide 19. We asked them, here's a set of 4 questions about climate change. Which do you agree with, or which is closest to your position? The climate's not changing. It is changing, but humans have nothing to do with it. It's changing, but humans have a little bit to do with it. It's changing, humans have a lot to do with it. Only 22% of evangelicals say, I frame it as 22% reject. That's reversed, I'm sorry. So that means almost 80% of them largely reject the consensus that it is changing and humans have a lot to do with it. Only 22% are saying humans don't have anything to do with it. They mainly do agree that the climate is changing, but they reject the idea that humans are causing it. I think that's particularly interesting because on other, and as you can see, it's the opposite for everybody else, including black clergy. I think this is interesting because the other science questions that we asked, the more traditional kind of religion science conflict questions like human evolution and creation of the earth, large numbers of evangelical Protestants reject scientific consensus, but so do large numbers of black clergy on those issues. On this one, obviously, the black clergy are more like the white mainline and the Catholics, so it's only the white evangelicals who stand out here. To me, that says it's just a sign of the politicization of this issue. Probably somebody could make a biblically based argument for rejecting human-caused climate change, but it's not a traditional religious issue in the way that human evolution. And this is a good segue into the politics part. White evangelical clergy are, this is not surprising, overwhelmingly Republican. 80% of them say they're Republican. Not more than 29%. The next biggest group is Catholics with 29%. That's not surprising. We also asked not just their political inclinations, but their political activities. And that's what's on the kind of busy slide 22, a whole bunch of different political activities. I think the key points here are the top 4 of these activities are what political scientists call cue giving. Just taking a public stand, urging people to vote, that publicly praying about an issue, and then the ones below that are more kind of direct action, that urged activism beyond voting, organized a political group, lobbied, protested, and what you can kind of see is cue giving is much more common among clergy than the direct action. Direct action is not uncommon, really, but much more likely to do cue giving. And then the other thing that stands out, if you look at the direct action items, is that the evangelicals are way less likely to engage in the direct action items than the mainline Catholic or black Protestant are. Not so for the cue giving. They're just as likely to do the cue giving, less likely to do the direct action. I think that's a little bit of a corrective that, because obviously you think of, evangelical mobilization for Republicans, and it's because they're more visible, because there's so many more of them. But they're actually, as a proportion, the clergy are less likely to be directly engaged in those kinds of ways in political activities. I think the other storyline here is we asked, have you ever endorsed a candidate outright? Which of course they're not supposed to do by tax laws. Very few, 9% overall, said that they did. It's probably an understatement because they know that they're not supposed to do it, of course. But I think the storyline there is black clergy are way more likely to have endorsed a candidate, 19%. And then we asked them, okay, if your tax status wouldn't be put at risk, would you endorse a candidate? And black clergy are way more likely than anybody else to say, yeah, I would definitely then. So there's, kind of an iron. You probably remember in the first Trump administration, there was kind of a move to make it not against tax rules to endorse or even to accept political donations that wound up not going anywhere. But I guess they haven't really talked about it here. I haven't seen. The irony of it is that if that went through, the ones who would mainly do it are black clergy. A lot of white clergy just don't want to do it, even if they could, for I don't know, maybe obvious reasons. But this recalls. Some of you may recall the Bush administration's faith-based initiative, the effort to get more public money to support religiously based social services. And really it was about getting money into to evangelical churches to do social services. But as it kind of started to play out, it became clear that the main people who were showing up at community meetings were black clergy and also mainline clergy, who were way more interested in government funds and way more open to it than evangelicals, which led them to stop doing the movement. That's an overstatement, but simplification. But anyway, there's interesting things there. We also asked, slide 23, about issues that they worked on. And there's lots of interesting details in there. The main different groups focus on different issues. I'm not sure there's anything super surprising in there. I think you'd probably predict which issues, which groups are mainly focused on, but maybe I won't go into details on there because I will, because I think what's more interesting is the slide 24 about political mismatch. We asked them, are you more conservative than politically? Are you more conservative than people in your congregation? About the same or more liberal than people in your congregation? And that's what's shown on slide 24. And there's a couple punchlines. One is evangelical Protestant, black Protestants are very generally well matched. 3/4 of them say, yeah, about the same. After the first Trump was elected the first time, there were some stories about evangelical Protestants being fired because they were not Trump enough. And it created this idea that evangelical clergy were generally not as conservative as their people. And it's not true. It obviously that exists, but it's mainly they are just as conservative as their people. The real story, though, is the mainline Protestants. 50% of whom say we're more liberal than our people. A fifth of them say I'm much more liberal than their people. This is part of the reason why you don't have mobilization on the religious left, church-based mobilization, because the people aren't where the clergy are. The clergy are much more liberal than the people, in a lot of cases, in a lot of congregations. This is not what's producing that. The mainline people are being less happy. If we kind of control for this, they're still less happy, even when they say they're well matched, because it kind of seems like it ought to. And there's hints it might be part of a story, but it's not the one thing that explains it. Yonat wrote about this. We did publish an article about this a while back. Yonat has already written about it. Okay, views against mental illness. I'm going to maybe, I'll do this and then I'll stop. But I think this is important. This was the both surprising and I think important. We presented them. The clergy are often on the front lines for people suffering from mental illness, and before that, no one had ever done a big survey. They asked, what are clergy telling people when they come to them for help with mental health issues? There's a lot of qualitative work and a lot of concern that clergy are, telling them, to pray and not go see a doctor, for example. And so we presented them with a vignette of a seriously depressed person. And we said two kinds of questions. What do you think's causing this? And what would you recommend this person do? And so on slide 28, You see the kind of basic results. The ones kind of, in the first grouping are what they said, and they didn't have to choose among these. They could say any of them. They were asked about each one separately. Very few, 29% said lack of faith, 16% said demon possession. So the vast majority, I was surprised by how few lack of faith and the religious interpretation of the causes was as low as it is. Even more, then when we asked them, would you encourage them to see a mental health professional? Would you encourage them to take their prescribed medicine? Would you encourage religious activities? Virtually all of them, 90% say, yeah, I would encourage this person to see a mental health professional. They also, big numbers, encourage religious activity, but along with, not instead of. And I think that's really important, and that is shown directly in slide 29, where we kind of grouped it into, did they recommend only, or did they say it was only a religious cause? Did they say it was only kind of a medical cause, or did they say both? And what you can see is the bottom bar are the people who said only religious cause, and I would only encourage religious activity. And what you see is tiny percentages of clergy would say, yes, do religious activity and don't go see your doctor. It's even among the most conservative groups, around evangelicals and Pentecostals, it's like 10 to 15%, whereas it's like 1% among mainline and Catholics who would say religion only. But so even among those groups, it's only a minority. With what should you do, 3/4, they do say do religious activity, but they say in addition. For the vast majority of clergy, the sacred is added on to the profane. It doesn't replace it, for only a minority of clergy out there. So I thought this was really good news. It says clergy are mainly allies to mental health professionals in responding to people. We published this in JAMA Psychiatry, because I thought mental health professionals were the main important audience for this. And we framed it as, this is good news. 90% of clergy are, telling people to do the right thing. And one reviewer came back and said, this isn't good news. There's still 10% who are saying that. And he wanted us to emphasize the 10% who are not. So we toned down the good news part of it. But I still think it's mainly that's mainly good news, and and I was surprised. I was surprised it was that. Another interesting detail back to the, I guess you can see it on this as well. Clergy have conceded the causes, the kind of explanation of where, this is depression, by the way. It's not about mental illness in general. Maybe you'd get different results if you asked about other things. But on depression, clergy have largely conceded causes, the theory of the causes of depression to medical science. They have not conceded treatments. They still think religious treatments are, even though they don't think there's religious causes, but they still think religious treatments are helpful. And I think that's an interesting thing about it. And it's kind of consistent with some historical work on the history of the relationship between religion and medicine. There's way more to say, but I'll stop. And we can talk about any of this or any of the other stuff if you want to page through and see if there's any of the other things you want to talk about. Thank you.
Great. Yonat, thank you, Mark, very much. There's a lot to chew on, and there's 25 more pages, so keep looking and make it interesting. Here we go.
Well, first I'd like to say that religion reporters get pitches for polls all the time, and over the years I've learned which ones you can rely on. And Mark's surveys have always been very careful, very well thought out, very solid, really foolproof. And he's also, I would say, especially responsive to journalists, which I also appreciate very much. So I want to thank you for your work. I think I'm not the only one, reporters recognize Mark Chaves' work alongside Pew as being kind of the gold standard, I'd say. Second, I want to say that I'm going to offer some observations. I'm not in any way a researcher. I never took a class in statistics, so what I'm offering here are some thoughts of a journalist who has covered religion for the past 25 years or more. So I've also written about Mark's previous National Congregation study and its various waves, and I've written about this particular study as some of the conclusions came out, some of the findings came out in previous years. So this survey, as you've seen, is really incredibly broad, and it gives a very granular portrait of US clergy with lots of data, demographic data on clergy age, sex, congregation size, compensation, health and well-being. Much of the findings have been corroborated through other studies and are familiar to most of us, I think, here. And it's especially valuable to have the data from 2011 to compare it to. We've known for some time that clergy are getting older and that many come to ministry as a second career. I found it really interesting that the age of clergy continues to rise. We've known for some time that Catholics have become much more racially diverse than evangelical Protestant groups, and the survey suggests that almost a quarter of US priests are Hispanic. I think that's good to know. We've known also for some time that the percentage of women clergy is gradually increasing, at least in mainline or liberal congregations, but barely increasing among evangelicals, and of course, not at all among Catholics. And that I found really kind of disappointing. If there was one group of clergy that I would have liked to see more demographic data on, it's charismatic, non-denominational Christians. This group of Christians, which now comprises Trump's primary supporters, deserves more attention. Mark told me they're included in the evangelical category, but I would be interested in learning more about the leaders of charismatic churches and what we've been hearing about in terms of NAR churches. I feel like these clergy have kind of evaded media scrutiny until very recently, and I know that's changing. And I know Jack, for one, is covering them more, but there's no question in my mind that they're kind of ascendant right now in the public conversation, and I'd love to see more studies on them. What surprised me in this survey is the finding that most clergy are happy and satisfied with their work. I would have written about this more, but I'm just not sure 5 years after the survey was taken how accurate it still is. We've seen other studies, notably there was one from Hartford Seminary that showed that the pandemic left many clergy stressed out and overburdened. And so I didn't focus on that, but I did focus on I wrote a story last week and wrote about the findings on science. Mark mentioned that in his press release, he singled out the finding that evangelical clergy reject the scientific consensus that human action causes climate change. And as you can see in slide 19, of all the religious groups, evangelical clergy stand out on this one. Only 22% believe that humans are responsible for climate change. And that is, of course, a tiny percentage and out of line with what most other Christian groups believe. That, too, is not particularly new. We've known that for a while. but it continues to, I think, confound most people. So in the piece that I wrote for RNS last week, I compared it to another data point regarding medical science. And here we see that most clergy, including evangelicals, endorse a medical approach to treating depression. As you can see on slide 28, 90% of clergy, including 87% of evangelical clergy, said they would encourage their congregants to seek out a mental health professional when dealing with depression. This suggests to me that evangelicals are not always anti-science. They clearly trust medical science. We see this also in another data point in the study regarding palliative care on slide 32. I found that intriguing that 64% of white evangelical clergy endorse palliative care at the end of life. That also means that in some circumstances, at least the way I read it, and I guess it could be read in other ways, but it seems to me like evangelicals are saying that patients should be allowed to die by withholding medical treatment, which suggests a kind of underlying support for medical science among evangelical clergy. So the contrast between those two views, the rejection of climate science, but the acceptance of medical science, I thought was really striking. And as Mark suggested, there's a motivating factor for that, and that is politics. Most evangelicals accept medical science because it has not been politicized, or at least it wasn't politicized when the survey was taken, which was 5 years ago. This is before the pandemic. But climate science is a totally different animal, and it's the Republican Party and Trump in particular are steadfastly opposed to any policy that would help ameliorate climate change, and evangelicals follow them in lockstep. Finally, what I found super interesting in the study is the stark contrast between mainline clergy and evangelical clergy, and how politically polarized they are. We've known about these differences between evangelicals and their more liberal counterparts for some time, but the study does give us some good data points. If you look at slide 23, political issues addressed by clergy, you can almost see a clear division of political issues important to evangelical clergy and issues that are important to mainline clergy. They tell a story of two Protestant traditions, one cleaving to the Republican Party on issues like abortion and LGBT rights, and the other kind of cleaving to the Democratic Party issues, race relations, immigration, poverty, and Catholics are kind of somewhere in between. And here, too, some things have probably changed since the survey was taken. Post-Dobbs, for example, I bet you would see a lot more liberal clergy speaking about abortion. This study was done pre-Dobbs, so you only get like 26% of liberal churches speaking about abortion. And it may also be, 5 years later that evangelicals are talking more about immigration. I don't know. But finally, there's one area in this study that left me with a lot of questions, and I'll leave them up to you. And I hope that Mark might take these up in future studies. This is the finding that shows that mainline clergy stand out as being much more likely than clergy in other groups to hold political views that are substantially different from the people in their pews. If you look at slide 24, you'll see the difference. It's like 52% of mainline clergy and about a third of Catholic priests said they're more liberal than their congregants. And of those, 20% say they're much more liberal than their congregants. And I just think about that a lot, and I wonder what explains it. I have a feeling that education plays a big role here, and that mainline clergy are far more highly educated. It would be really interesting to see where did mainline clergy go to school, what kind of institutions they graduated from, as opposed to evangelical clergy. It's also, I think, a matter, I think education is the primary reason for this difference, but it may be also a cultural issue. I'm just thinking out loud here. It could be that mainline clergy are in congregations where they're permitted or even encouraged to have challenging opinions and contradictory opinions and dissenting opinions. Maybe mainline clergy are mostly located in cities with diverse populations, whereas evangelical clergy are in smaller or more tight-knit communities where they really have to watch what they say, or they're not allowed, really their congregations don't give them permission to give any kind of dissenting opinions. I don't know, but I think that's really worth watching. And I hope Mark gets to do another round of surveys to find out. I would just conclude by saying that what I felt like reading this survey is that there really are two very distinct forms of Christianity. I know less about Catholics, but it's just very stark when you read the survey that mainline Christians behave one way, evangelicals in another way. It's really two different types of Christianities, I would say. So, thank you.
Great. Thanks to you both. That was great. Thank you. All right, over to you. I think first up is, let's do Carl Cannon.
Whoops. Over here. I'll do this one. I have a short question for each of you. I'll start with you, Mark. You said that in that slide about their relative to happiness in their work, that the mainline congregation leaders, that they're declining doesn't explain it, but it seems to me it would explain it. If I would have had a newsroom, thriving newspaper, growing staff, money flowing in, I might be happier than presiding over a dying newsroom and no ad revenue. Why wouldn't it be the same for these guys?
I don't know. When I say it doesn't explain, I mean, we controlled for, some mainline congregations are in declining congregations, others aren't. When you compare the mainline clergy whose congregations are not declining with the evangelicals who are not declining, the mainline are still less happy. So even controlling for that, it doesn't, that difference doesn't go away. Yeah. Maybe it reduces a little bit. So when I say these things don't explain it, we couldn't find like a silver bullet that explained it. It might be like Chris's, I need a list of 15 things that will, together tell the story. And we just haven't done that analysis yet. But we couldn't find anything obvious like that. Or the political mismatch is another kind of obvious one but it just doesn't. Statistically, the difference is still there within the groups of, and I agree that's puzzling. That's the story.
Okay, Yonat, my question for you is, what you're just talking about is the difference in the global warming to this medical consensus about clinical depression. So I guess my question is, I'm asking you as a writer now, not a statistician, because that's what you and I are as writers. Rick Warren's son committed suicide, fought clinical depression valiantly for years. I think this was well known in evangelical circles. It's a well known example. And they talked about it openly. And Rick's wife started being active in this world. And I wonder how much of it is simply that global warming is just a different thing to them. It's been thoroughly politicized, but clinical depression is something that has hit home, that all these pastors have dealt with it in their congregations, if not their families, if that may be explaining the dichotomy. That's my question.
Absolutely. That's what I'm suggesting. That climate science has been politicized by the Republican Party, and medical science has not been politicized in the same way. Again, this is pre-pandemic, but yeah, it just hasn't. And so they're free to take it up. Absolutely.
Just a quick PS, to hang on what Mark said about mobilization being limited as a result of that sort of mismatch. I think there's, in our space, something to pay attention to there, that if a cleric doesn't totally fit her or his congregation, if they're not totally aligned on politics or on sort of cultural, then does that diminish the comparative showing up that evangelicals seem to be able to amass? All right, Christian Smith.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Very interesting. I have one main methodological question and then two dinky, I'm going to take three, but two are dinky.
He's a sociologist.
Same spot as yesterday.
Empirical
Sociologist.
clarification. So the main methodological question is focused on the happiness and satisfaction finding. And what I want to raise is the possibility of you having overestimated clergy happiness as a result of survival bias. Meaning you have people who are still clergy. You don't have a sample of those who left in the last 1, 5, 10 years. And so it could be either as a group or differentially across traditions. Those that were unhappy dropped out, and so they're not in your sample. So I'm just curious if you have or if others have data on clergy dropout. Obviously, if people stick with it, then there's less of a problem. But if you know anything about, in general, the profession or across traditions, if people leave and why they say they leave, and how that might affect the happiness. Do you want me to leave that or ask the two other?
Yeah, the other one too.
Yeah, the two other dinky ones are, is the evangelical climate change, is there any correlation with education? Because there's a lot of variance in that is, are evangelical pastors who are BA or MDiv more likely to accept the climate consensus? The second is, who are the 23% of mainline Protestants clergy who are Republicans? Is that by age? Is that by rural? Is that by denomination, or what? Those are just empirical clarification. Midwesterners, okay.
Yeah, I think the first point is exactly right. These are people who are there. I don't have in my head numbers or information or leavers. Do people leave clergy at higher rates than other? Or is that different? I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. I just don't know if that's a known thing or not. But yeah, it's true. These are the ones who leave or who are still there. I will say that on the mainline less happy point, we did ask ourselves, okay, are the mainline does the mainline, because this is one of our, when I say our, one of my graduate students, and I thought, anecdotally, we think it might be that the mainline attracts to the clergy more people who don't exactly want to be clergy. They want to be, organizers or something, and
therapists.
And then they get to church and they realize, about all the pastoral work and so on, and that's not actually what they signed up for. And so therefore maybe they leave. So we looked if the mainline clergy, actually maybe this is relevant also. We did compare the mainline clergy who are, early in their careers to the mainline clergy who are later, to see if the later ones are happier than the early ones, but it wasn't there. So maybe that does speak to the leaver one, because you might expect if that was the dynamic that the early career people would be less happy, and I don't think that's there. But the fundamental point is right. We don't know about the leavers.
Okay.
I I don't remember the other.
The evangelicals in
climate
education on climate change,
Oh.
and who are the Republican mainline Protestant?
Yeah, the answer to both is great questions. Obviously, we could answer that. I don't know. I haven't looked at either of those. That's great examples of things we could do going forward. I don't know the answer to either.
Will Salatan, you still have one?
Yeah. I was going to ask a question that Yonat basically explained it. but my question was about slide 19 and the mental health numbers that you had were the most interesting thing to me. And I was looking at the same thing, the distinction between that and the climate change numbers. And I think you referred to, I don't know if it was in the slides, numbers on discrepancies on evolution and creation. So here's the general question that I wanted to ask, which Yonat got into. Are there these categories, and Carl was touching on this too, are there these categories of issue that determine whether the degree to which the denominations, the Catholics and Protestants and mainline, differ on these questions? And the categories, so one is the politicized issues, as Yonat was talking about. One would be, climate change. That would be an easy one. Then there are, I don't know what the term is for these, not political, but theological, or something like evolution. Maybe the literal word of the Bible would be part of that. And then the category that I'm kind of interested in, and I'm wondering whether the mental health numbers are a clue to this, are what I would loosely call pastoral. So the clergy person is having to deal with the reality of mental health a lot. I was curious looking at the numbers on same-sex marriage, which also seem to line up. That's a politicized issue. You might deal with that as a clergy person, but statistically, you're a lot less likely to run into that than you are in the mental health. So is there some kind of, do the data suggest that there may be some kind of effect of an issue becoming, that it's a pastoral issue and you have to deal with the reality of it, even if it's politicized in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big part of the overall story. I think this relates to Carl's question and point too. There's another instance of that I don't highlight, but that I think is a sign of the same thing, and it has to do with the end of life. So we ask a general question. Well, let me find the end of life slide. What is it? 32. 32. Okay, good. Yes, but actually 33 is the one. So we asked if you are visiting and counseling someone who has been told they have less than 6 months to live, would you encourage them to hope for a miracle cure? And as you can see, 78% of evangelicals say yes, 64% of 64% of evangelicals, 78% of Catholic and mainline much lower. We have a separate question in a different part of the survey about basically, do you believe in miracles? Just in the abstract, in the general. And the numbers are way higher across the board for all the groups. They're probably higher, I don't remember off the top of my head, they're probably higher for evangelicals and Black Protestants than they are, but they're higher than these numbers. And I think it's another indicator of what you're talking about, is that in the abstract, it's a lot easier to say something in the abstract than it is apply it in a concrete human situation. So yes, I do think that's an appropriate interpretation of the depression results, and also this is another little indicator of it, that practical experience or being faced with a real person in a real situation makes it harder to express things that are a lot easier to express in the abstract.
Dan Silliman from CT.
Two, I think probably quick questions. One, am I missing it, or did you not ask about congregation size?
We have that data, yes.
Okay.
I hesitate because these clergy are leaders of the Wave 4 National Congregation Study congregations, which was a real advantage because it meant we didn't need to ask them about anything at all about their congregation because so we do have congregation size which also doesn't explain the malaise thing, by the way, not just the.
I did wonder, connect to that, the serving more than one congregation. I have seen pastors that are doing sort of a new circuit rider thing, but there's also been a growth and then a backlash against multi-site churches. So I just wonder, like, with the 9% of evangelicals who are serving more than one congregation, how many of those are serving 3 congregations of 20 people, and how many of those are megachurch pastors, serving thousands of people at 5 locations across an urban landscape?
Yeah, I don't think we would have counted the second as serving 2 congregations. So I don't have specific numbers in my head. We could calculate those, I think. I think that seen is the former more than the latter, just conceptually. I don't think we would have counted a megachurch. There are tricky conceptual things of what is a congregation because of multi-site things that maybe
you think the way, sorry, wouldn't you just have asked, do you serve more than one congregation and let them answer yes or no?
Yes, that's right. And but we did do a lot of pre-testing and following. I mean, I don't know, my intuition is that people wouldn't say yes to that, but maybe you have a different intuition about that.
Mara Gay.
Thank you, this is fascinating. I'm really struck by slide 24 that 52% of mainline clergy say they are somewhat or much more liberal than their congregation. And just thinking about what we heard yesterday from Pew, about how many Americans are spiritual, or maybe I would call it kind of religious curious, but not engaged. And then of course my own personal experience being raised kind of loosely Christian agnostic, and then coming to find church later on, looking for a church as a liberal. I just wonder, there seems to be, you're talking about it as mismatch, but is there any reflection, Mark, among religious institutions, in particular mainline Protestant ones, about, hey, our congregations are, I assume, getting older, smaller, and there seems to potentially be a very large interested constituency who is maybe not well informed about our own views, because there's a deep sense in my community in Brooklyn, for example, well, church isn't for us. And that's based on the people who go, not the clergy, apparently. So there does seem to be a constituency there, and I just wonder, is it an outreach problem? Is it a PR problem? Maybe Yonat as well, you may have some insight onto this, but I do find it fascinating too, as a smaller point, that the most engaged, growing, thriving congregations, anecdotally, just as a journalist and a New Yorker, actually appear to be my liberal Jewish friends who are extremely engaged in synagogue, and that there's a deep alignment there of values and, frankly, also just activism in those congregations. And there's a hunger for that, but you don't see that. And so I just wonder if there's any work being done to kind of investigate that. Is there any reflection?
Yeah, I think mainline leaders are endlessly obsessed with trying exactly what you're saying and thinking about all the time. You've probably seen just lately there have been ad campaigns. I think that have been showing during March Madness basketball games or something. I mean, are they the United Church of Christ or something? Jesus gets us. Basically liberal Protestant messages. And various denominations of the more liberal denominations have done ad campaigns over the years. And so, yes, they are, I think, lots of focus and lots of efforts, including national ad campaigns and various, and they don't work. But it's not, I don't think it's lack of awareness or lack of trying or lack of attention to it. It's just, they don't work.
Although that campaign, right, was more funded by the Greens than by a group of.
Is that what it was? Yeah. Okay.
So it's a hanging.
But it was a kind of a liberal message.
Message to recruit a little bit or pull. Yeah. Curious spark. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that message was actually funded by evangelicals.
Yeah, okay, sorry, my bad.
And did you reference Barna earlier when you were saying about
No, I
leaving the
definitely
pulpit?
didn't.
Okay. Okay. Alan Cooperman.
Great. So first of all, I want to make an appreciative comment and then a question. The appreciative comment, Mark, just for people in the room, they might not quite realize this, and you're just too humble and gracious to say it, but what you've done here is very hard to do. There's a reason why there's only one previous data point you're able to point to, and it's 2001, and that's because getting a representative sample of clergy from across the country, a good sample done well, is really hard. So everybody should know that. Then the question
And that
is,
01 was Pew and somebody else together or something?
That was Lily.
it was not Pew. I mean, honestly, one reason I can say that is we've thought about trying to do this, and we've also known that Mark was doing it, and I'm very aware of the methods. I won't go into it, but it's done very well, and it's a really hard thing to do. It's frankly a lot harder than most of the kind of things we do, which is just general population studies. It's relatively easy to get a good sample of the population. Not easy, but relatively easy compared to getting a good sample of an elite group like clergy. There's no list. There's no up-to-date list of all the clergy in the United States. So, all right. Question, and this is, when I look at your study, there's one thing that just makes me gasp and say to myself, well, there, but for the grace of God go I, and that's that your field period was 2019 to 2020, June 2020. So to state the obvious, COVID hit partway through your field period, and I don't know this, but you probably do. How many of your interviews were collected before, say, March of 2020, and how many after? And I just wondered if you'd reflect on that a little bit, maybe share some of the data. Were you able to look at those that came in after COVID? Did they differ in any systematic way? And any thoughts you have about the impact of COVID, clergy and congregation?
We have looked at exactly that. We have about 130 that came in after, I think, March 20th was the day it was national emergency was declared. We have compared on basically every item, the ones that came in after March 20th, and there's essentially no difference in any of our items. Now, there's one item that we're doing. We asked an open-ended, what challenges are you facing? And more people say the pandemic after March 20, versus nobody says it. But on the well-being items, there's no difference basically on any items. Now, partly that's because most of our items are things like, in the last 2 years, have you, or generally are you, so they're more kind of stable, longer term things. But it also might just be that it was too soon for maybe a year later, people are more burnt out by what they were doing in the pandemic than earlier. So you're not exactly right. We need another survey. We need a wave 2. This is to the funders in the room. It's very hard to do. It's also very expensive to do. We need to do it again to assess the change. I think the vast majority of things, my gut feeling, are not like, was it Chris or Alan or somebody, I think it was Alan, you were saying the early, not so early anymore, but the indications are that religion is kind of returned to where it was before the pandemic in general. Way more congregations are streaming their services than were before. That's one long-lasting thing. So the well-being one is the most obvious to worry that it's really shifted since. But I will say our finding of a lot of the clergy are in bad shape and more unhealthy and so on than others dates from before the pandemic, that research. And the reason is that one reason they were overstating it is because they were focused on mainline clergy. And mainline clergy are less happy than other people. So once we get the full picture, it's a corrective. So I think that's probably going to hold even if after we do a wave 2 post the pandemic. But that's an empirical question that we have to go back and answer. So I think I answered your question.
Sarah, you got to follow.
Yeah, I have a follow-up to that same question. I also wonder if science will, like, we've had a lot with vaccines, mental health, like since COVID, we have RFK now in office or in government. So I'm wondering if you think, like, over time, if you think that'll shift, you know, again, with the politicization of climate change, I actually think we're going to see more and more with mental health. Like, there's this popular book called Bad Therapy. There's an attack on mental health services as well. I think it's similar and it goes alongside. So I'm kind of curious, like, do you plan to, you know, looking at, like, are they advising on areas other than mental health, but in the science area, like pediatrician?
Yeah, that would be a great, we will for sure in a wave 2 want to ask these other kinds of questions. We did ask a vaccine question, but it was, do you talk about vaccines? It wasn't your feeling, and it was pre-pandemic. So yeah, I mean, each time with the congregation study, which we did in 4 waves, each time there was a new wave, we tried to balance repeating questions so that we could track change, but also asking new questions because new things arise. And so I completely agree that a wave 2 would want to not just track the same stuff, but add other question about other issues that have emerged. Yeah, I agree. That would be, but we need, again, to the funders in the room, we need, you know, a wave 2.
Now, that was off the record. This is a non-solicitation environment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Kelsey Dallas, Deseret.
You just referenced this, the question about challenges. So first, was that an open-ended question? And then I guess second is kind of a comment. I feel a little sheepish knowing that it's only 15% mentioning finances and less than 1% talking about LGBTQ issues, because those are a huge part of the coverage
Yes,
that I
know.
do. And I'm like, whoa, only that.
We were
so
surprised.
few
We were
people
surprised
worried.
by that too. Yes, it was an open-ended question. It was like the last question on the survey. Tell us what challenges you face in your work, and so then we coded it afterwards. So if we had asked closed-ended questions, all these, you know, when you ask closed-ended questions, more people would say yes to them. So
Slide 56.
yeah, slide 56. But I still think it is surprising. You know, the first one is, you know, completely consistent with the kinds of things we've been talking about yesterday. The half of them said something about declining commitment to religion. Or an interesting nuance there is that not uncommon was, you know, one version of that was, you know, we live in a secular society, it's so hard to get people interested. But another version of that was, it's so hard to get my people participating, you know, more than just showing up on Sunday. So it was expressing frustration about the commitment and participation levels of the people in their congregation. So I think it's the rank order is meaningful, I think. But yes, it's important to keep in mind these were open-ended questions, and so, you know, whatever on their mind, we weren't prompting them.
How about Ryan Struck, CNN?
Great, thank you so much for doing this. My question's about the religious beliefs that that some clergy hold. I was interested to see on slide 35 just some of these mainline Protestant numbers, specifically the believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ at 64%, which some people would probably say is the definition of what it means to be a Christian. So I'm interested whether you have longitudinal data on that, and if not, just if you have any thoughts, because I'm interested in whether there's like a little bit of a common thread here with yesterday's conversation about becoming spiritual, kind of like the nothing in particulars. Chris's work about moralistic therapeutic deism, and I'm just kind of interested in your take on that.
Yeah, I found this surprising. It didn't surprise me that there were these differences, but the magnitude of these differences, how low those percentages are for the mainline clergy, I did find surprising. This also, by the way, doesn't explain their lower levels of happiness, and we did look at that. I mean, they are more, historical in their views of what religion is, and metaphorical, maybe that's a better word, in their views of Christian theology and teachings. I mean, that's not new. That is, what is taught in, I think Yonat's exactly right. The explanation both for the political mismatch and for these is, I'm sure they're more liberal in these ways coming in, but I think they become more liberal in mainline seminaries. The Bible is a human-produced, to be understood with the way you'd understand any other kind of literary product, produced by people, and people tell stories about what they believe, and that's liberal Protestant theology, and here it is. But I was surprised by the magnitude of those differences.
Kelsey, you've got to follow up.
I was just going to comment that that slide perfectly fit my experience at Yale Divinity School. So I was getting an MA in religion alongside mainline Protestants getting an MDiv to become religious leaders. And these are my friends, like people who are pastors who it's not really about the theology, it's about the work of a clergy person, like you were saying, that it might be about leading people, political engagement, helping people as a therapist, and not really like, yay, I'm so excited about the Bible. Yeah. So I do agree that the gap is quite large, perhaps larger than I would have predicted, but it does fit my friendships with those folks.
Yeah, I think it's real. There is not, I don't think, an earlier data point on this. They didn't ask about this in the 2001 study. No one, to my knowledge, has written about this out there in the world. We haven't. So have at it. Here it is. And it would not be hard to find qualitative, stories to tell that would bring that to life, and because it's a real thing.
Kelsey, my experience at HDS was very similar. 130 students per class. I think there were like 4 people in my class who would say that they would assent to that claim about Jesus Christ being literally raised from the dead. And I was complaining to it with a buddy from Harvard Business School one time, and he said, that's not that big a deal. This place, Harvard Business School, HBS, over here, 2/3 of HBS is BS. All right, Jack Jenkins. Let's get one more question.
Yeah, I will end as a mainliner who also went to divinity school. I will tepidly defend my tradition in that, I read that slide and was like, oh yeah, Marcus Borg's theology of the resurrection, very specific, taught and instructed. It is a theological idea to a lot of these folks. It's just different. But to that point, I was kind of struck with Yonat was kind of bringing up about the kind of wild difference between mainline and Black Protestants here and evangelical Protestants. I think that was deeply encapsulated in the Bishop Buddy sermon, on Trump's first full day in office. I will note Tamara's question earlier. I had to track some churches immediately after that, and there were several evangelical churches that were flooded with people that Sunday afterwards. And I followed up a couple weeks later, and those people were gone. And so I don't know what that looks like over time, if they retained any of those people. But I'm struck by, in slide 37, where, you see this ecumenical support most strongly felt among mainline traditions. That's in keeping with their history. But given the tension that Yonat flagged, did you get a chance to ask these traditions about each other, right? I'm curious if how evangelicals feel about mainliners, how mainliners feel about evangelicals, how Black Protestants feel about Catholics, how Catholics feel about evangelicals, that sort of feeling. I was curious if there has been any sort of rising animosity and tension, particularly given how strong the reaction we saw to Bishop Buddy's sermon from the evangelical right, a couple months ago. And then my second quick thing is that on that slide about physician-assisted suicide, I was going to ask this question while we've been talking. A story just broke that apparently the medical team for Pope Francis considered ending his care when he was in the hospital.
Yeah.
And that, to a question that was raised earlier, is there any correlation between the fact, it's just so much higher support for physician-assisted suicide among mainliners than any of the other groups. The only distinguishing factors that I can see there, it's not just about liberal politics or theology. Black Protestants would also fall under that category. Is there any correlation with the age of their congregations, and that mainliners are more often dealing with the dead and dying than necessarily just because it's so much of their congregation?
Yeah, great question. I don't know is the answer. I'm saying I don't know a lot. There are so many potential correlations and that one could look at, and I just haven't had the bandwidth to look at all the possible ones. So I don't know. I haven't looked. I did wonder, because the Pope Francis health story has been in the news for a while, in one way or another. It did strike me, and there was an article a couple weeks ago in the Times, I think, about connecting it to Catholic teaching about end of life, and Catholics are particularly high percentage, 78. They're the highest who say patients should be allowed to. And I thought it's a great example of. Let me just say this broadly. I wanted to get this point out there. It'd be great to have stories about these results in particular that center on these results. But from my view, there's a longer-term value to these data, which is they can serve as a resource for national statistics, for context, for whatever you're writing about. So a story about, discussions around Pope Francis, about that, you could imagine, why not? It could be helpful to have a statistic like this, in my view, this is a gift that keeps on giving. It's on the website. There's a big appendix. Those of you who see the report, with lots of basic statistics. One of my agendas in this outreach effort is to just alert journalists to this resource being there. The National Congregation study similarly, that whatever stories get written or not about essentially about these results, they can serve, there's so much about so many different subjects that can serve as a resource for a lot of different stories you might work on in the coming years. And that's a good example of the kind of thing. And also, like Alan said yesterday, some people have suggested some analyses break out of the Pentecostals. If there's some particular breakout you want, like Alan said yesterday, you could email me and say, hey, could you generate this for me? If I have the bandwidth, I'll do it. I try to help, and if you are interested in something in particular.
Let's do one more and then take a break. Kathy.
Follow up with Jack here. Just for a clarification, physician-assisted suicide, physician-assisted dying is not the same as withdrawing or withholding care.
Right. We asked about both.
The rest of it. Yeah. So that's really not the same thing. And the bishops have long said if people want to withdraw from care, there's a process for that. So that's not a news point. But that wasn't the question I was really planning to ask. Can I go ahead to my original question here?
Please, of course.
Okay.
It's not a news point except for the patient.
I'm sorry, what?
It's not a news point, as Jack said, except for the particular patient.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I think that right now, a lot of people in this country feel like they're standing on quicksand. There's so much chaos politically. There's nothing in here. I didn't see that there was a question about immigration, about who is my neighbor. And I think that there's so much, depending on how much longer this goes on with the Trump administration, this could be as existential change in this country as much as COVID was an existential experience for millions of people. I really hope that you redo this survey, because I don't know, was there a reason that immigration, for example, was not even on the radar for asking about?
We asked about it. It's one of the political issues that we asked about.
Yeah.
But we didn't ask attitudes about it, that's true. Yeah. But we did ask issues. So on slide 23, it is, Catholic and mainline clergy are way more likely to have focused on immigration when they're politically active than other groups. So it is on the radar screen of some groups of clergy. I will say in the National Congregation study, we saw a big increase. So that was done in 2018. 2 years into the first Trump administration, there was a big increase from the earlier National Congregation study in focus on immigration among the more liberal clergy. So it is on the clergy radar screen. It was on our screen. We did not ask about attitudes about it. Let me also say, I forgot to answer Jack's question. We didn't ask attitudes about each other. It'd be a great set of questions for the next survey, as with immigration questions. But let me also mention, Kathy, call your attention on slide 32, like Jack said, we did ask about both withdrawing possible treatments and about physician-assisted suicide. And 45%, clergy are way more likely to support withdrawing than they are physician-assisted, but 45% of Catholic priests said that they would, in some circumstances, agree way more than, that was surprising to me too, that, 'cause, I mean, obviously the general public, that's the similar pattern, way more support for withholding care than for actively helping it along, but that's there too, and the Catholics being way more. Anyway, I think I think it's more interesting, these patterns, than it might seem at first glance.
Thank you.
All right, why don't we take a 15-minute break and regroup just a little bit after 11 o'clock. All right, friends, if we could ask you to take your seat, we'll try to start in just about 1 minute. So you're saying something for... Yes, please. 2 minutes, yeah. All right, just a couple super practical things. I know there will be various sort of waves headed out in Ubers. If you want to find people to cluster, there's a big group leaving at 2:15. I think Kathy Grossman, there's some people who will be leaving earlier than lunch.
Yep. Wants to go then.
Doesn't hurt to stick together, and that will help the economics. And then, Mark, you wanted to say something. Oh, real quick, lunch. We'll say a word about this in a minute, but lunch is in a slightly different room. I think it's the Royal Palms Terrace, so it'll be sort of out, but to the left this time. If you follow the herd, that should do it. If you want, you're welcome to leave your bag in this room. They said it's safe, or you can take it as you see fit.
Yeah, 2 little things. It's on the opening slide, but I should say out loud, this was completely funded by the Templeton Foundation. Thank you very much. I want to make sure to get that on the video and everything. It would not have happened without their support. And the second thing is I need to correct that my response to Kathy about slide 32, I misread my own figure. It's the mainline who are the highest percentages of both endorsing withholding possible treatments, and Catholics are higher in the first, but on the assisted suicide, it's the mainline, not the Catholics that are the highest. You probably all noticed that, but I wanted to, maybe you can go back and snip out my misstatement from right before the break on that. And, it's still interesting, but it's the mainline who stand out on that, not the Catholic priests.
But yeah, put in that he said that it was Chevy Chase.
Little reorchestration, it'll be perfect. And we won't mention another word about a certain university down there in Durham. Okay, so Sam Benson, Politico.
Yeah, thanks to you both. Really fascinating stuff here. Dr. Chaves, 2 quick questions. First one is the decision to group in Latter-day Saints with evangelicals. Curious what went into that decision for methodology. Second, our discussion yesterday dealing with the different sources that some religious folks are turning to for spiritual guidance, whether it be social media influencers or cable news hosts or things like that. On that challenges slide, slide 56, in your responses there, did you see anything from clergy discussing who they're competing with for the attention for spiritual guidance of their congregants? Did they express any frustration with this kind of new wave of spirituality that Dr. Smith discussed? Thanks.
The answer to the second question is no, we didn't ask about that. And I don't, in the open-ended responses to the challenges, I think I don't think we coded this explicitly, but I think the main thing they feel like they're competing with is the secular world in various ways, not other religious groups, but we didn't ask about that directly and didn't code it directly, and it was open-ended. Yeah, on LDS, I put them, that's not a theological judgment. There's people have different opinions. Should we consider Mormons Christian? Not on theological grounds. I'm not taking a position on the theological question, but sociologically, I feel like that's the right, they're more like the evangelical in the various ways. That's why. And there's such a small number of them, they're just not enough to, same thing with rabbis and imams, so just not enough to pull out separately to be able to look at. I try to include, if I can, that's why. It's a sociological judgment, not a theological judgment.
Andrew Egger from the board.
Microphone desert here. Thank you guys both for giving us a lot to think about. This is maybe kind of a foolish question about just kind of how polls work in general, so sorry about that. But I was just struck both yesterday, specifically in the Pew stuff about the religious middle, and today in slide 35 here about the different beliefs that clergy hold. But what we actually mean when we're talking about definitely believing anything, like the essentially like self-reporting of a lack of doubt as a proxy for like intensity and depth of various beliefs that are assented to intellectually. Because I mean, like it occurred to me that when we were using that specifically to talk about the religious middle, it at least seems possible that you could imagine like somebody who is way at the end of the spectrum in terms of like a cloistered nun who is right down the line on everything in the Catholic Catechism and everything like that, and lives this life constantly, but experiences doubts, right? And who would then, according to some of these poll questions, sort of fall out exactly the same as a mainline Protestant clergy who is primarily there for cultural reasons or things like that. Or on the flip side, you can kind of imagine a couple of people who basically have the identical sets of religious principles that they're assenting to intellectually, but they have just different levels of psychological or like epistemic bedrock feelings of certainty. I don't know whether that is a thing that you can control for at all. I don't know if you are just like kind of assuming that the bedrock population more or less means roughly the same thing about being sure about things, or I just wanted to like kind of know if you have any thoughts about any of that at all.
Yeah. I mean, essentially that is the assumption, the working assumption that people are generally meaning the same thing. Believe it or not, there is extensive research by psychologists who do survey research, I guess some sociologists too, on trying to assess the semantic differences between different adjectives that you would use in questions like this, of whether you should say you strongly believe versus you definitely believe, and the difference between saying moderately and only a little bit, and have tried to do science about how to narrate certain labels. There is more consensus apparently about than other labels, and so the essence of your question is yes, it's an assumption. That the bottom line that's there's not a lot of variation internal to that. We did try to follow basically best practices on how to label the categories. Alan probably knows more about this than I do, but there's it's surprising how much research there is on these kinds of things. The other thing I'd say is I try very hard, because of course we shouldn't take things too literally in interpreting survey results. I try very hard not to overinterpret small differences because of concerns like this, and not also sampling error things, but I try to only interpret and highlight kind of big differences where I can be more confident that whatever measurement error there is produced by that or other dynamics is not what's producing the. But if you have a specific, is there some item you're specifically suspicious of because of that? Just as a general question.
I mean, I was thinking about yesterday with the term absolutely certain about various. I'm certain about some things, but am I absolutely certain about them?
Yeah. No, the idea is that, and there is also research on different ways to label the most extreme category will produce different percentages of people in the most extreme category. Because if you say very or extremely or absolutely or definitely or something, each of those people will cognitively respond differently to those, and you'll get a different percentage in the highest. But since we're mainly comparing across groups, you kind of hope that whatever that dynamic is, it's working similarly across the different groups. But it's true that people there will respond differently to different words.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have anything anecdotal on? Yeah, just
I would just also say that it's kind of interesting to see to what extent pastors are responding with their congregants in mind, and whether, I think the way the pastor responds says a lot about how strongly they are secure in their position, and a lot of other things, not just their own personal beliefs, but their relationship with their congregants on certain issues. So if you just had a big fight in the congregation over an issue, you might respond one way, and you might respond differently under other circumstances where you feel more independence to speak your mind.
Mm-hmm. And we hope that those wash out, in the aggregate, we hope that those variations wash out. Can I call attention to one thing on the main line being less religious? We focused on the beliefs, but let me call your attention to slide 38. We asked about one religious practice, and that's praying outside of the public setting, and the main line are less likely to pray in their daily lives. So it's not just the belief, it's also the practice, at least that one practice.
Back to Alan's PE, your practices and beliefs. And okay, so Chris Smith. Oh, sorry, Kat. Sure. Yeah. Back to you.
Really legally, but I'm just curious about.
Hit that button if you would, Dan and Chris.
Chris, hit the mic button.
Perfect.
Oh, sorry. Slide 23. The phrase, distinguished leaders who have addressed.
One more time, Dan. Hit one more time.
I just turned it off, sorry. The phrase have addressed an issue in slide 23. What was the exact question wording, and how might the idea of addressed, could that be over the dinner table with one family?
No, it was it was in the last 2 years. It was only asked of people who said they were politically active. And it was, I may not come up with the exact question, but it was in the last 2 years and addressed in communicating from the pulpit or in other communications with your congregation. So it was publicly, it wasn't. We did clarify that in the question.
Sorry, did you say that was only asked for people who are politically active?
Yes, which is almost everybody. 85% said yes to one or another of those.
I just run into pastors who will define issues like immigration, economics, and abortion as not political on a regular basis.
Right. Well, we didn't start with, are you politically active? We said, here's a list of activities. What have you done in the last 2 years? I think we said, and anybody who said yes to any of them, they got the follow-up questions about what issues did you address in that activity. And yes, it was even the political activity questions. The literal question focused on in your role as a congregational leader, not just in your private life.
But you didn't find out the pro or con. Like, did you say for pro-life or for pro-choice? It's just the topic.
We did in the NCS, and it's what you'd expect. We didn't in here. No, we didn't follow up with pro or con. Yes. I think so. I mean, I think your intuitions are correct about which groups are on which sides of which issues.
Jason Shelton. Hit that button though, Jason. Hit that button if you would.
Mark, I want to go back to slide 17. And earlier you kind of hinted you would theorize about the level of unhappiness, that distinction between mainliners and other Christian leaders. I just want to hear that because I'm sitting here thinking, trying to put it together for myself. Want to give you a chance to go for it. I would love to hear your perspective on that.
So our one idea, I can't remember, maybe it was just talking just to a few people. The one idea we had was that the mainline attracts, it's kind of related to the less orthodox religious, so that the mainline attracts more people who are coming to the ministry not just to be pastors, but to be community organizers or leaders of various sorts, and then they get there and they are called to be pastors in a congregation, and that it's about that. It's about a misfit, not on the political side, but just on the this is not what I thought I was signing up for, and here I am. But so we tried to assess that by comparing the early career people with the later career people, thinking that, okay, maybe if they are attracting more people who just aren't good fits, those people will leave. And so when you get to the people who are longer, the difference might disappear, but it doesn't. And we were really disappointed to not, because that's such a good story. We were disappointed that the data didn't immediately support it, because it kind of fits some intuitions about what's going on. So that was the main idea.
Another question real quick, and I can't remember which slide it was, but looks like you've changed the question about beliefs about the Bible compared to...
We wrote that, yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
So, and again, I can't remember what slide number that is, but Black Protestants in that literal interpretation of the Bible is sky high.
Yep.
And then you added the two new questions that are more detailed qualifiers. And it seems like, so the mainliners are in that far group, which is the Bible's, which one, 36? The Bible is the inspired word of God, but it's got a whole lot of catches in there that kind of say it's inspired, but that middle category is the Bible is inspired, but still is sort of mistake free. So anyway, I guess I'm just wondering, did any ideas on that racial difference with Black folks in that first category relative to, I guess, that evangelical second category? Like Black folks, Black Protestants and evangelical Protestants have pretty much mirrored one another. I think you've got a nice story there in terms of that finding. Just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that discrepancy.
Yeah, we did try to improve on the typical way of asking this by making some finer distinctions. There were actually 5, I think, different response options. If somebody has the report, you could find the other 2. We list them, they're not in the slide. The most kind of extreme on one end was the Bible is not inspired at all. It's a book of fables with little to do with anything today. And basically nobody took that. Not even the most liberal mainline people took that. So it's not there. So these 3 were the ones where kind of seemed to make the distinctions among the groups. I guess I didn't find this that surprising that the middle category. If you kind of add up the left one and the middle one, that's kind of the more traditional way of reading the Bible versus the inspired, but not all historically accurate, part of culture. So I guess I didn't find this that surprising, I guess I would say.
I guess I do.
You do.
In the sense that for evangelicals, that there's a movement, at least under this circumstance, away from literal. And I think there's something, I just wasn't expecting that. I guess when I really looked at it, I figured more evangelicals would stay on that literal, but
all the way to the left.
Yeah, all the way to the left. I guess I'm just, bless you, just a little surprised by that. And at 32% for Black folks, that doesn't,
I see.
Us being the majority over there, I get that. I'm just a little more surprised that the inspired word, that language, that word is, let me be careful what I'm saying here, is typically a word you would associate with mainliners. But
well, the without
under
errors
these qualifications, I see.
Yeah, the without errors. I was trying to capture this distinction that I think, and it seems like it did capture this distinction between sort of fundamentalist and evangelical or something about, so it still has the without errors part. All of it applies today. I don't know, were other people surprised by this? It matched my expectations about where evangelicals would fall. So it's interesting that you're surprised by that. No. I was surprised actually that almost nobody picked the more extreme, even in the most liberal mainline. None of them were willing to say, yeah, it's not inspired at all. No, almost none of them.
Couple more. Should we go to Dan?
You said there were 5 with the Bible question. What was
Yes.
What was the fourth
I know.
one?
I'm not going to come up with it, but somebody can maybe, is this the full report?
This is the full report, I believe. Yes.
Okay, I'll try to. I mean, maybe if somebody has a report on the table, if you go to the theology section, it's in there somewhere. We list them. I don't know if I can find it quickly. Just let's see.
I think they're
The page 26, if you're looking at the report. So the Bible is the actual word of God to be taken literally, word for word. Is that the one that's on there on the left? Inspired word of God without errors. That's the one that's in the middle. Inspired word of God still speaks to us. So those three are the ones that are on there. Then there was the Bible is not the inspired word of God, but its stories and wisdom contain much that is true and relevant today. I thought more mainline would go there. And I was surprised how few went there. So I guess they just don't want to say it's not inspired. I thought that wouldn't put off as many. And then the most extreme was contains a mix of legends, stories, moral precepts with little relevance. Not surprising, maybe that basically nobody went there. So it's that fourth one that I was surprised more mainline didn't go for.
Great. And then my other, I don't know how to test this, but I wonder about the difference between mainline and evangelical clergy in how they end up at their congregation and how much of a factor that might be, both with the happiness and the political misalignments. I spent last year reporting a lot on the people who became global Methodists, and many of these little rural congregations had stories about a bishop wanting to punish somebody and sending them a pastor who didn't want to be there and was like clearly unhappy with them for 2 years and just sort of sticking it out until they got assigned somewhere else. That never happens at a Baptist church, right? Most of these evangelical churches, it's either the congregation has complete control over the process or the pastor started the church. So it's not surprising to me that if you start your own church, that you attract people who agree with you versus the presbytery sent somebody to you who, you had an interview process. So I don't know if there's a way to like think about the different process for how clergy end up at churches, but it strikes me that it might explain a couple of the peculiar
I think
factors.
it might, on Methodists in particular, of the large Protestant groups, I think Methodists are the most, bishops controlling things. I have this recollection, I haven't looked at it. We could compare. I think there's probably enough Methodists in particular to just compare Methodists to other more congregation-based, not centrally controlled. I have this recollection that there is evidence from other surveys that there are more mismatches of various sorts in Methodism in particular, which is plausibly interpreted as if you're not letting the market forces, match people, that it would produce more mismatches of. So I think there is some evidence to that. I have not looked at it in this data. One could look at it in these data, I think.
Jack Jenkins.
I actually have a question for Yonat. It's not lost to me that this survey comes out of a university in North Carolina, which is also where you work, and it's a particularly interesting state to read this survey within, given that that's the home of Franklin and Billy Graham, as well as Reverend William Barber, who is both simultaneously among the more prominent Black Protestant pastors and a mainline pastor at the same time. I'm curious how you read this report, given your years of experience reporting in North Carolina, how this looks like on the ground. Dan and I were talking earlier about how, sometimes you can see animosity between, evangelical clergy and, say, mainline clergy in the ether. But in practice, they'll be like, I don't know about those mainliners, but like the Lutheran minister down the street is fine, and we collaborate on things. I'm just curious, if you've seen the divides that you were talking about, form rifts in communities over the course of the years, if you've seen, what this kind of, how this is reflected in what you're seeing in North Carolina.
That's a good question. I read it as, as the typical kind of urban-rural divide in many ways. Many of the mainline pastors that I deal with and interview are in live in very cosmopolitan communities with large diversity of people. Many of the evangelical pastors that I deal with a few notable exceptions, are in rural communities. So their views are different because of that. There are rural communities both in the mountains and towards the coast, and the cities kind of in between. So, yeah, that's just my initial thought. I'd have to think about it some more.
I have one quick follow-up empathy question, I guess, to raise to you, which is, we've heard a lot yesterday and today about the dismal state of things, the decline, the leveling off, what's possible, what's looking, not super encouraging from the point of view of religion. Did this survey make you more empathetic to the plight or reality of clerics today? They're dealing with a lot. There's only 470,000, you say, so that's like 1% of the country would be 3 million people, so that's like 1/6%. It's a small number of people, really.
Mm-hmm.
How did you come away from all the swimming in the data and all of those calls that your team did, relating to that vocation?
I would say there's some good news in here. I mentioned it along the way. I thought the attitudes about mental health was good news for the world. And I thought the happiness, how satisfied generally they are, they're not less unhealthy than the general population. I've done other work on clergy. You hear a lot about clergy student debt. But it turns out it is a problem. Student debt is a problem for clergy, but it's a problem in the society. And when you compare rates of student debt and how much they owe clergy and other professions, it's the same. It's like exactly the same. So it's not more. So the things the clergy, I came away thinking that the clergy are not, don't stand out as being more stressed out and more unhappy and more unhealthy than everybody else is, which is that good news or bad news? I don't know, because there's a lot of stress and burnout and unhealthiness in the American, and debt in the American population. But so I came away, I'm not sure if empathy is right, because that implies they're in tough shape and we should, but I came away thinking they're not as in tough shape as, again, back to Chris's question, these are the people who have stayed, and these are also the congregations that still exist. And so it's a picture of, the healthier parts of American organized religion or something. So we should keep that in mind. But I would say my main reaction to it was as it offers a corrective to certain narratives about not decline. The decline story is real, but certain narratives, and that shows up in that challenge, thing. But
so if you were titling this panel and it wasn't Embattled,
no, it wasn't at all. I almost, I didn't pick that title. Josh didn't.
Plugging along.
It's about so many different subjects, so it's that's why I need a better public relations person to what's my headline as a clergy in America, because I have a lot of things to say about a lot of different subjects. So to me, it doesn't. I don't know. I have trouble with a big headline that captures the whole thing. Can I mention something? Because you mentioned William Barber. I didn't put this in your handout, but if you happen to have one of those copies of the report on page 56, we did ask people. Tell us your top 3 most helpful sources of information, and tell us the top 3 people, if money was no object, who would you like to invite to speak to your congregation? And William Barber shows up among the top 3 for mainline Protestants. This is nationally, not just in North Carolina. The top 4, there's this interesting overlap among the groups, if you could look at that, but there's also differences. The top speaker the evangelicals like to have is Franklin Graham, and then Francis Chan, and then Tony Evans. Tony Evans also shows up for Black Protestants, but the top speaker choice for both Black Protestants and mainline Protestants is Barack and/or Michelle Obama. So it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun results. And actually, this is a question. It never would have occurred to me to ask this, but Dick Gibson at Templeton really wanted me to ask this. I don't know if Templeton thought we'll fund people to get their speakers, and we just want to know who they are. So it's the Obamas for the Black Protestants, and the top three for the Catholics were Bishop Robert Barron, Pope Francis, and Scott Hahn.
In the U.S.
Yes.
In the U.S. Yeah.
Yes. This is the U.S.
Right,
yeah, that's right.
Oh, nice.
I will add that Barber, whenever I go to see Barber, his audience is almost 99% white.
That's interesting.
Kelsey, Dallas.
I just wondered, Mark, if you had anything to say about responses from women religious leaders versus men.
We did comparisons. So you can only really do this comparison in the main line because that's the only place there's enough women to compare, enough women leaders. I was saying somebody earlier, maybe it was Alan, we did not find a salary difference, for example, between women. That was a little surprising to me. I thought there's kind of conflicting evidence out there about whether in the main line have women are still being paid less in equivalent situations, and we didn't see it. We saw equivalence, so that was a little surprising. That was one of my first thoughts of on maybe that's the difference for the mainline malaise thing is, well, they're more female, and the females under more stress and more unhappy, but it's not true. It's that difference is there for men as well as for women. Those are the two main things I remember looking at comparing the men and women in the main line. Yeah, we could do that comparison for a lot of other things too. Those are the two main. I think they're more theologically liberal than the men are. I think I remember that too on those Orthodox belief items. I think the women are lower than the men on that. Maybe don't quote me on that without me confirming it, but I think I recollect that was true too.
Matt Brown.
Thank you for doing this. It's very insightful. I'm interested in slide 21, where it shows that about 4/5 of white evangelical clergy are overwhelmingly Republican. And I'm just interested in how other demographics identified on that. Did other clergy identify with the Democratic Party, or was it more largely that they were independent? Was the Green Party some dark horse?
There were small numbers, not Republican or Democratic, but yes, it's mainly Democratic, who the other side of that. I don't remember the literal numbers, but I don't remember big numbers of anything other than Republican or Democrat.
And then just a follow-up, did you ask or would you consider in the future asking in terms of clergy political activities if they themselves, I don't think I see it here, but would run for office or would consult political leaders?
Yeah, that'd be a great question.
There's a black Protestant and an evangelical pastor currently in the Senate.
So. Yeah, of course, yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, no, I'll put it on the list of things to ask in wave 2. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Chris.
So your categories here are based on denomination, so rel trad, right?
Yes.
Okay. I know in the past we haven't seen eye to eye on, but I would be interested if you did this again, if you asked a religious self-identity question, either of the pastor, but even better, the congregation. And Jack's question made me think of this because having lived in Durham, like the flagship evangelical church for Duke is on 9th Street, Black Knoll Presbyterian, which is PCUSA. It would come under mainline here, but it's as evangelical as you can get. And when I first showed up in Durham, I interviewed somebody from a downtown United Methodist church, and he tried to evangelize me to get me to become a Christian. Like he was willing to do the interview in order to convert me, basically. And that was also mainline. So, I mean, you already acknowledged this in the beginning, but you obviously got to get denomination. But if you could ask just one question about, in general, would you say your congregation is mainline, Pentecostal, fundamentalist, You make it sharper, interesting comparative results.
Yeah, I agree. I think we could get at some of that because we do have their own personal religious beliefs. So we could, using the questions about the Bible and about prioritizing evangelizing, isolate or separate out compare the people with more evangelical beliefs in mainline. But we could do that even with the items we have. But I agree. Asking the self-ID would also add something. And I think that would be an interesting thing to do as an analysis. The people who are minority in their religious group. Is Blacknell really? I thought Blacknell was PCA. Maybe I just assumed it. And it's PCS.
Can I ask Alan if you would weigh in at all on what just was spoken about, the evangelicals and conservative versus Republicans versus Dems trend? Like, the last 15 years awfully well. Is this finding that it's about 80-20, I guess, in this study, make sense to you? Has that changed substantially? I would guess if the number was 81-19 in the last roughly couple election cycles in terms of the vote, it wasn't necessarily party driven, but about candidate personality. How does the evangelical political line up?
80-20 sounds to me about right for evangelicals in the general public. One of the things we've just touched on is how do you define who's an evangelical? And there's at least 3 ways I can think of to do it. The classic way that we're probably mostly talking about is self-identification as an evangelical. We do that in our studies, and if you do self-identification as an evangelical, you get a much higher number than if you do it evangelical by identification with a denomination. So of what the share of the general public is who are evangelical. So if you just ask, are you a born again or evangelical Christian? In some surveys, you might get 35%, maybe even 40% of the population saying yes. If you limit evangelical to people who identify as Protestants or identify with Protestant denominations and then classify denominations as evangelical, or you can make finer grained, then you get down to something like 25%. And a third way you could do it would be to ask a bunch of litmus test questions. Do you believe this? Do you believe that? Do you do this? Do you do that? That's a little trickier from my point of view, because then as a researcher, you're imposing a set of litmus tests that others might not. So, but just generally speaking, Josh, I would say 80-20 is about what it's been in most presidential elections. Exit polls also make this really difficult. The best data that I would use for this would come a year or more after an election, and we don't have it yet for the 2024 election, and that would be what's called validated voter studies, where you ask people whether they voted and you ask them how they voted. Nobody else knows that. And then you limit your group to those who actually did vote. So you're using the public voter file because, as we all know, self-reports of how people voted are not correct. And many people tell you they voted and they actually didn't. And some people will tell you they didn't vote and they actually did. So validated voter studies are the best. The exit polls are sort of a wreck in various ways. And maybe particularly a wreck on this question, because some of the exit polls still ask an old question: are you a born again or evangelical Christian, not born again or evangelical Protestant? And so you get a certain number of people who are Catholic, et cetera, who answer that question positively.
I didn't give you a slide, but let me just give you the basic breakdown of these religious groups. In this sample, 6% of the leaders are Catholic, 21% are mainline liberal Protestant and predominantly white, 43% are evangelical conservative Protestant and predominantly white. So there's twice as many evangelical Protestant clergy than mainline clergy, white, in this sample, which I think roughly represents that proportion in the population. And that's why for example, we should keep that in mind when the lower percentages of politically active evangelical clergy, but you're as an absolute value, there's way more of them out there, and so that they're more visible than it might seem because there are more of them. And then 4% Jewish, and then 4% everybody else, basically. That's the overall sample.
In the data we have, like your slides, would Jewish be included in the overall number?
Yes,
Okay.
everybody's included in the all. The rabbis are in there, the imams, everybody's in the all clergy, but then there's just the 4
There's
Christian
the
groups.
Christian breakout.
Yes, yes, they are included in there. There's just not enough of them to isolate as a specific group reliably.
Sarah, do you have one more?
One thing I like asking pastors about rabbis is what are they like fearful for, or what are they hopeful for in various ways? And I'm wondering if you feel like the data that you captured kind of gets at that. And it seems like you ask questions about job satisfaction, which are really interesting. Their salaries, all these details. But I'm wondering if do you think any of this helps us see kind of to the future? Like how are they projecting themselves out, or their congregations, or?
Yeah. Probably not. Maybe the challenges question overall, the fact that by far the biggest expression of a challenge in their work is the, commitment of people. I guess one could interpret that as, this is their core work in a way, and that is their main focus. But no, we didn't ask anything directly about future plans or orientation. No, I don't think so. Sorry.
And I'm not saying you should have. I'm wondering if you think like there's something to be said about like looking at did anything surprise you that they're like actually more satisfied, or they're maybe they're fine, they're happy with their future. I'm interested in the mainline Protestant dissatisfaction with their job because they have the highest salary. I think they have good pensions. Like they're sort of set up for the rest of their lives in a way that other clergy are not. Their congregation decides like, we don't like you anymore. They're gone, and they don't. They are often in professional precarious situations. So
that's why the unhappy ones aren't leaving.
Back to Chris's old book.
Yeah.
That's the embattled and thriving part about.
Yeah.
And also, do we know anything about entering seminary age? Like, I wonder if that's a piece of it too. If you enter at a lower age, does that make you inclined to be more happy in the profession, or any of that?
We do know about it. ATS, Association of Theological Schools, has data about average age. That average age is increasing. You're asking, is there a correlation between age and of entry, so to speak, and these things? And we do know their age, and we know how long they've been a pastor. So I could look at that correlation. I haven't, but one could assess
maybe that like you were in a profession that you didn't really want to be, and then you finally get to do the career you actually wanted to do, maybe?
Yeah. Well, again, we did look at compare the early career to the later career, which seems like it should be related to that. Maybe it's a different thing, but one could dig into this more with these data. No.
Well, you can't say we didn't give a little bit of heft. A lot to take away. One more, Carl.
Not a question, a joke.
Oh.
Inspired by Professor Smith's yesterday presentation. So a guy dies, and he wakes up, and he's in front of the pearly gates. Let's say his name is Daniel Smith. And he's there, and he says to St. Peter, whoa, what can I tell you about my life? St. Peter says, you don't have to tell us anything about your life. We know about your life. You were a good man. You were pious. This guy he was a good guy, and he didn't sin much. And he had one quirk. He was kind of a conspiracy theorist, but other than that, he was a good guy. And so St. Peter says, no, you're getting in. But you can ask God one question, only one. And the guy says, one question of God. I said, yeah. I said, okay. Who killed JFK? And God says, Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy. He acted alone. There was no one on the grassy knoll, no second gun, no conspiracy. The Warren Commission had it right. And the guy thinks to himself, man, this cover-up runs higher than I thought.
That's great. That's great. All right. Okay. A little something to help tell the kids tonight. And then a whole lesson about JF. All right. All we have for you is that we'll circulate contact info, email only for participants. We have a very simple evaluation form coming your way. The two main things are, do you have a person or two to nudge to this Cromarty forum? There's still a little bit of time on that. And do you have 2 or 3 people you would recommend to come to Faith Angle next time? Those are the big priorities. Otherwise, lunch is served. It's straight outside, a little bit to the left. It's in the Royal Palm Foyer. You can eat inside or you can eat outside. Up to you. And no, it's sit down. If you want to take something on the road, we'll try to help you. But it is? It's box lunches, of course. Of course it's box lunches. That question is a lot higher up than me, okay? All right, so bon appetit. Thanks for coming. Thanks to our speakers.
Thank you. Thanks all of you for the attention. Appreciate it.